Not every family begins with blood. A bond could exist beyond species. In 1988, a 62-year-old widow named Etta Marsh lived alone in a wooden cabin on the edge of the Kawishiwi forest. One spring morning, her fishing bait and traps were mysteriously tampered with. Not by bears, not by humans. That night, under the moonlight, she saw a towering figure, broad-shouldered and upright on two legs. She raised her gun, but didn't shoot. The truth no one talks about. A Bigfoot father and his curious daughter had found her, and instead of fear, they began a silent exchange. Smoked fish for carved wood, wild berries for woven grass. Over 2 years, they formed something few would believe. A friendship. A family. This story comes from a dusty attic journal, discovered decades later by Etta's grandson, a wildlife biologist. Along with it, a compass, a heart woven from reed, and a memory too profound to dismiss. Watch until the end and you'll understand why Etta was never truly alone, what Bigfoot really gave her, and how one silent gesture under the smoke of wildfire became their final goodbye. If you've ever felt unseen, unspoken to, or untouched by kindness, this story is for you. Because some connections don't need words, just trust and footprints. Trong the early breath of spring, when the Kawishiwi forest still held its silence like a held breath. The last patches of ice cracked and drifted downriver, melting into dark water that murmured against the banks like a secret trying to escape. Fog clung low to the ground, thick and slow, smothering the trees in a soft, silver hush. It moved like a living thing between the trunks, brushing the knees of saplings and curling around the posts of the cabin that stood alone at the edge of the river bend. A place so quiet, even the wind felt careful when it passed through. Etta Marsh, 62 years old and wrapped in an old blue flannel shirt buttoned up to her neck, stepped off her porch with a worn tin pail in one hand and a coil of wire in the other. Her breath made short clouds in the air. The frost had thinned overnight, but the damp still clung to everything. Her boots, the wooden steps, the iron handle of her fishing traps. She walked like someone who'd made this path every morning of her life, each footstep deliberate, each sound absorbed by the sodden forest. Down by the river, the traps lay half submerged in the thaw. She crouched low, pushing her sleeve back past her wrist, then reached into the cold water with the steady patience of someone used to waiting. But there was no fish, no bait either, and the wire loop that should have held the bait was uncoiled, undone cleanly, not snapped, not chewed, untwisted, smooth. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't curse, just stared, then looked up slowly into the fog, her eyes narrowing. The trees stood still. The forest offered no answers. Back at the cabin, her mule, old Della, stood tense at the edge of the clearing, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Etta followed her gaze. Something was wrong in the way the animal froze, how her hooves held firm in the mud, as if the ground had suddenly grown unfamiliar. There was no sound, no rustle, but the mule wouldn't move. Not forward, not back. That's when Etta saw it, a shape in the trees, huge, still as stone. Between two trunks just beyond the tree line, a silhouette stood upright, taller than any man she'd ever known. No movement, no sound, just presence. The kind that bends the air around it. Her hand went to the rifle propped by the door frame. She lifted it, not rushed, not panicked, just cautious. She took aim, held her breath, and then lowered the gun. Slowly, almost respectfully. The shape didn't flinch, didn't vanish. It just watched, or waited. By morning, the fog had receded, burned off by the soft light of a spring sun that filtered through the high pines in gentle threads. Etta stepped outside with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm in her hand, and paused before her first sip. There, on the porch, Tucked neatly beside her boot scraper lay a single reed stalk, dried, stripped clean, and stuck upright between the slats of the step, perfectly balanced. A thing placed, not dropped. She said nothing, just stared. Then, quiet as breath, turned and went inside. Later that afternoon, when the wind picked up and the shadows crawled long across the grass, she smoked a slab of lake trout she'd caught the day before. The scent carried sweet and oily on the breeze, mixing with cedar smoke from her chimney. When it cooled, she wrapped it in muslin, tied it with twine, and carried it to the flat stone halfway between the cabin and the river. The stone she used for splitting kindling, setting buckets, drying herbs. Today, she cleared it, wiped it with the hem of her shirt, and placed the fish in the center. No note, no words. Just the offering. She stood for a moment longer than needed, her eyes not on the woods, but above them, to where a crow circled once before drifting north. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin, the wooden boards creaking under her boots, the door clicking shut behind her. By dusk, the fish was gone. No scraps, no muslin, nothing. But in its place, laid with quiet care, was a piece of driftwood smoothed by river current, its surface scraped with 3 shallow lines, parallel, equidistant, deliberate, like someone had carved them with a thick fingernail or a dull blade. Not random, not accidental. A message. She picked it up slowly, thumb brushing the grooves, and felt something shift beneath her ribs. Not fear, not wonder, recognition. Like the forest had cleared its throat and finally decided to speak. That night sleep came late. The fire cracked low in the hearth, casting a warm blur across the floorboards. Etta sat in her rocking chair by the window, the piece of wood resting on her lap, her fingers tracing its markings over and over. Outside, the trees stood watch, unmoving in the windless dark. The moon, high and bone-white, drifted behind a scrim of cloud, and the shadows stretched like long fingers across the porch. She wrote a single line in her journal before turning in. Something else walks this land, and though she left her boots by the door and the rifle on its hook, she locked the window latch that night, not from fear, but to mark a change, as if her home had shifted half an inch on its foundation, as if the trees had leaned closer, as if the river now held stories that weren't just her own. At the edge of sleep, she thought she heard breathing. Low, slow, deep like thunder buried under moss. Not threatening, just there, as if the forest itself had drawn near enough to exhale. She did not rise to check. She only closed her eyes and listened. Summer moved in quiet, slow waves through the Kawishiwi forest. Warm air thick with pine resin and the endless drone of cicadas stretching across the canopy like a soft warning not to move too fast. Ferns unfurled along the stream bank, their green delicate and new, and somewhere deeper in the woods, something kept pace just beyond sight. Etta Marsh noticed it not by sound, but by silence, the way the forest sometimes held its breath, the way her mule, Della, turned her head as if listening to a language that had nothing to do with words. But Etta didn't spook easy. Not anymore. She walked the path to the river with her basket slung over one shoulder, the woven handle cutting gently into the fabric of her faded cotton dress. Her hands moved with a quiet rhythm, checking for mushrooms near the shaded stones, plucking wild onions from where they nestled in the damp soil, then pausing when the light flickered just so, when the leaves stirred without wind. She didn't look up, not right away, but her fingers slowed on the basket edge. It wasn't the first time she'd felt watched, not the sharp gaze of a man or the twitchy stillness of a deer before it bolts. No, this was different, curious, patient, not close, but not far. It never rustled branches or cracked twigs, just noticed. That afternoon, she found it. 2 rows of broken stones near the river's bend. Not natural, not scattered by rain or paw. They arced from the muddy edge up toward a sugar maple, bending slightly in the middle like a question mark. Clean breaks, edges too fresh to be old. She crouched and brushed away the moss from one, ran her thumb across the fracture. The bones of the forest. Someone had moved them. She stood there a while, just stood, then went home without saying a word. The next morning, Etta returned carrying a muslin bundle in both hands. She had picked blackberries before dawn, fingers stained deep purple, and wrapped them in a square of rough linen tied with twine. She knelt beside the same stone slab near the clearing, the one that had held the fish the last time. She set the bundle down in the center, looked up at the woods, and gave a slow nod, more to herself than anything. Then turned and walked back, her shadow long behind her. That night, the moon was a silver coin riding low in the sky, painting pale light across the clearing. Etta sat on her porch with a cup of dandelion tea, her knees covered with the wool shawl Ruth had knitted back in '72, worn thin now but still warm. She didn't expect anything. She just waited. For nothing and maybe everything. By dawn, the bundle was gone. In its place, neatly arranged where the linen had lain, was a braid of grass, wide, flattened, and tight, as if pressed between palms large and knowing. Not woven in a rushed child's way, but deliberate. It had a quiet elegance, a shape meant to say something without words. Etta picked it up gently. It was still cool from the night air, and smelled faintly of river mud and crushed cedar tips. She pressed the braid between 2 pages of her field journal and wrote beside it, "Exchange acknowledged." Later that week, she saw it. Not clearly, not fully, just a sliver of movement behind a birch tree on the hill. A smaller figure, just over waist high, darting behind bark too fast to focus on, but there. And beside it, the unmistakable vertical shape of the larger one. The protector, the shadow. Etta didn't call out. She didn't move. Only turned her head slightly and stayed still until the brush stopped quivering. That night, she found herself sitting at the edge of her porch again, holding something she hadn't touched in years. A compass, brass-cased, heavy in the palm, the glass still scratched from a fall back in '69. It had belonged to John, her husband, long gone now. She used to keep it beside his photo in the kitchen until the photo curled from the summer heat, and the compass ended up in a drawer she didn't open anymore. But now it lay in her lap, ticking faintly when she tilted it. The needle still knew where north was, even after everything. She thought about placing it out there, as a gift, a token, but she hesitated. Some things were just too full of memory to give away, even to the woods. That night, moonlight poured through the window like quiet water, and the face of the compass gleamed faintly on the table beside her, its arrow tilted just so, like it was listening too. Etta closed her eyes and saw John in his uniform again, standing in the middle of that same clearing, tipping his cap with a grin, the badge shining under spring rain. She hadn't seen his face that clear in a long time. She smiled without meaning to. 2 days later, after a rainstorm that soaked everything down to the roots, she walked the trail and found a piece of driftwood washed up near the same stone. This time, it wasn't carved, but it had 3 straight scratches along one side, then a new mark, a slanted line, like a child learning to cross letters. She turned it in her hands, felt the grooves again. There was a rhythm now, a pattern forming, and something else, like a lesson being passed between generations. She wasn't the only one teaching. That evening the wind picked up, and for a moment the air changed. Warmer, charged, the kind of shift that made birds go quiet and dogs raise their noses to the sky. Etta stepped outside and scanned the tree line. No movement, but she could feel it. The presence hadn't left. It had grown bolder, closer. When she sat on the porch with the compass in her hand again, she looked out and whispered something she hadn't said in years. "I'm still listening." Behind her, the kettle began to whistle, and from the trees, far off and low to the ground, came a sound. Not speech, not animal. A breath, maybe. Or the sigh of something ancient shifting weight between its feet. It didn't come closer. Not yet. But it didn't leave either. Later that night, Etta lit a candle and set the compass on the windowsill, facing out. She didn't open her journal this time. She just watched the wax pool and harden, watched the flame stretch and bend in the breeze coming from the crack under the door. Sleep didn't come easy. Outside, the river kept whispering, and somewhere in the woods, someone, or something, was drawing lines in the dirt, copying patterns, marking a world they were both just starting to understand. The leaves had turned by the time it happened. Maple crowns burned in red so fierce they looked almost lit from within, and the wind carried the smell of distant wood smoke through the thinning canopy. It was the kind of afternoon that made you pause before stepping outside, just to take it all in. The light warm and slanting, the air edged with that sharp note of approaching cold. Etta stood on her porch with the laban in her hand. She'd polished the glass with the sleeve of her flannel, though the scratches never quite came out. The brass case had dulled to a soft amber, like an old wedding ring. She ran her thumb along the edge one more time, then placed it gently on the wooden railing and stepped back. One step, two, then lowered her gaze. The clearing was silent, and then, from between the trees, she came, a figure no taller than a fence post at first, emerging from shadow like something born of bark and breath. Upright, thin-limbed but solid, covered in a shaggy coat the color of wet pine needles, yet somehow soft in the golden light. Etta didn't move, didn't even blink. The girl, because it was a girl, somehow she knew, paused near the edge of the trees. She stood there, watching with wide black eyes that didn't dart or flinch, just held. Behind her, barely a breath behind, a larger shape stepped forward and then stopped, placing one massive hand against the trunk of an old aspen. Still, steady, a presence like stone. The father. He made no sound, just waited. The girl moved forward, one small step, the way a fawn does when testing frozen ground. Then another, until she stood at the edge of the porch. She didn't touch the compass at first, just looked at it, head tilted like a dog listening to something humans couldn't hear. Then slowly, carefully, she reached out. Her hand was covered in fine dark hair, but the fingers were long, the nails dull and worn. She touched the side of the compass, not the glass, the edge. Her hand trembled just slightly, then steadied, and then she did something that made Etta's throat tighten. She pressed a finger against the lid and rotated it, gently, just once, clockwise. Then she crouched and with one knuckle, traced a long, slow line into the dirt at her feet. Straight, purposeful. She paused, then added a short, vertical mark at the end. Like a sentence, Etta, heart thudding slow and heavy, bent down too. Without a word, she ran the tip of her boot through the dirt, drawing a soft arc, a curve like the letter J, then stepped back. The girl studied it. Her brow lifted just slightly. Then she turned and looked up at her father. He hadn't moved, not a finger, but his eyes, deep set and dark, flicked once toward Etta. She felt the weight of it like weather pressing against the chest. A warning, maybe, or something closer to caution than threat. She didn't speak, just coughed, sharp, dry, unplanned. The sound echoed off the porch posts, the father's head tilted. A half-second passed. Then the girl raised a hand and gave a tiny, clipped cough of her own. Not loud, not mocking, a mimic. Her face didn't change, but her shoulders did. Less guarded. Something uncurled in her posture, like the tight thread between them had loosened. Etta felt the ridiculous sting of tears press behind her eyes. It had been years since anyone had copied her sounds just to say, "I'm listening." The wind kicked up, rustling leaves across the clearing, and the father finally moved. Not toward, but slightly sideways. A single shift of weight that blocked the gust from his daughter's back. He was massive. Easily 3 heads taller than Etta, with shoulders so wide they seemed to carry the tree line with them. But it wasn't the size that unnerved her. It was the silence. The total, unquestioned command of his stillness. Like he could erase himself in a moment if needed, or pull the entire forest around him and disappear. The girl crouched again and began to drag her fingers in the dirt in smaller motions, like writing letters in a language she hadn't quite learned. Etta knelt too, ignoring the ache in her knees. She didn't touch the girl, didn't dare. But she traced a slow circle beside her drawing, then connected it to the J. The girl looked at it, then at Etta. There was a pause. No sound but the wind combing the treetops. Then, like it had all been enough, the girl stood. She stepped back, turned, and vanished into the trees without a single broken branch or disturbed leaf. The father followed after, and for just a second before the shadows swallowed him, he turned his head and looked back, not at the compass, at Etta. Then he was gone. She stayed kneeling long after they'd left, her hands trembling not from fear, but from something else, something bigger than words. The compass still lay where she'd placed it, but now the lid was open, and inside, at the base of the needle, sat a tiny braided strip of river grass, placed there gently, with care. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen with her back to the stove and the oil lamp burning low, the braid beside her journal. She didn't write much, just a line. She spoke today, not with words, with mimicry. Her cough returned just before dawn. Not as sharp this time, but enough to wake her. She wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped outside into the crisp air, the frost painting the porch rails in silver threads. The sky had started to pinken, and the trees held that early hush again. She looked to the stone by the path, empty, but the drawings in the dirt were still there, smudged by dew. She traced them once with her toe, then stood, staring at the tree line like it might part again. It didn't, but the feeling hadn't gone, and in that space where silence usually sat, something else lingered now. Recognition, curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a lesson passing between species not with tools or fire, but with rhythm. A line, a sound, a shape. She understood now that the child was learning. But not alone. She was being taught. And somewhere in that silent wood, a father was watching too. The first snow came early that year, blowing in sharp and fast like it had been waiting just over the ridge. By the time the sun dipped low behind the bare spines of the trees, the wind had picked up enough to rattle the stovepipe and bend the porch lantern sideways. Etta pulled her collar higher and checked the latch on the cabin door twice. She could feel it in her joints before she even saw it coming. That kind of winter that starts as warning and settles as weight. It was a dark evening, the kind that lands on a place with both hands, covering every sound in a cold hush. The forest looked pressed flat by the storm, its edges blurring under the snow. She hadn't seen them in weeks. But that didn't mean they weren't watching. She'd spent the afternoon gathering dry rations from the root cellar, stacking jars near the stove, laying out extra bedding just in case. She didn't know why. It was just a feeling, one she didn't question anymore. There were signs. There always were. The first was the deep huff she heard through the wind. Not close, but heavy. Low and rounded like something exhaled by lungs twice the size of hers. The sound didn't rise. It didn't echo. It landed. She stepped out onto the porch, lantern in hand, and scanned the tree line. Her breath came out in bursts, curling tight and fast in the freezing air. And then she saw them. 2 sets of footprints in the fresh snow. One large, one smaller, side by side. Coming from the trees toward the cabin but stopping just short of the clearing. She hadn't heard a thing, not one branch snap, not a crunch. But the prints were there, clear as anything. She didn't hesitate. She turned, went inside, lit the second lantern, and pulled the thick wool coat from the hook by the stove. The old duster she hadn't worn since '84. She grabbed a quilt too, not the thin one but the heaviest, stitched with old feed sackcloth and lined with cotton batting, and wrapped it around a pillow from the cot. She moved slow, deliberate, like her hands had already done this before. Then she opened the trap door to the root cellar, cleared the crates of onions and apples, and laid straw across the floor. Nestled the makeshift bed into the corner, lit a third lantern and placed it near the opening, its flame casting a low, golden glow against the dirt walls. Then she stood back, brushed her palms on her jeans, and left the cellar door open just wide enough. On the way out, she placed the wool coat at the threshold like a gesture, not an invitation, a provision. Then she waited. Night fell hard, swallowing the clearing, turning the cabin into a flicker of warmth in a sea of dark. The wind howled against the roof. Snow piled quick on the steps. She sat in the rocker near the window, fingers wrapped around a mug she didn't drink from, eyes fixed on the trees. An hour passed, then two. Then she heard it. Not the huff this time. A shuffle. Just one, then quiet. And when she looked toward the root cellar, the lantern was gone from its place. She stood slowly, heart thudding not from fear, but something older, something that hummed deep in her bones. She opened the back door just enough to see without letting the heat out. The cellar hatch stood open. Inside, the lantern flickered, now moved to the far corner, and curled there, barely visible beneath the folds of quilt and straw, was a small figure, tucked tight, breathing slow. The larger one was there too, crouched near the entrance, massive back blocking the wind, one hand braced against the frame like a sentry. He didn't turn when she stepped closer. He didn't have to. He knew she was there. She didn't speak. She only nodded once and stepped back into the house, leaving the door open just a moment longer than necessary. Hours later, when the storm reached its peak and the chimney moaned like it was mourning something, Etta lay awake in bed, listening to the wind. But under it, so faint she almost missed it, she heard something softer, the sound of shifting straw. Breathing, alive, safe. At dawn, the snow had crusted over in places, shining like sugar where the sun hit it. She stepped out with a shawl over her shoulders and boots still damp from the night before. Her breath came sharp. Her knees ached, but her hands were steady. The cellar hatch stood open now, empty, but beside the step, right at the base of the porch, was a small loop of braided grass. Tight, even, hanging from a notch in the wood beam, like someone had twisted it into place with fingers that didn't need to be taught how. It wasn't just decoration. It wasn't wild. It was a symbol, a thank you. Etta stood staring at it for a long time. She didn't cry. Not quite. But she felt something shift behind her eyes. Something warm and sore and tender, like a bruise that only ached when you touched it gently. She brought the braid inside, placed it beside her compass on the mantel, then opened her journal and wrote 5 words. They trusted me last night. Later that morning, after the sun had climbed high enough to melt a line down the center of the roof, she went out back to check the prints. They were still there, circling the cabin, big and deliberate, not just passing through. The larger set had walked the perimeter in a full loop, guarding, watching. She followed them around until they disappeared into the tree line, then stood for a while longer, staring into the woods. She whispered something under her breath, a word she hadn't said since John was buried, not out of grief, but reverence, family. And though the woods didn't answer, the wind softened. The trees stopped shaking, and somewhere, not too far, she thought she heard straw rustle again. Spring came back harder than before, wild and impatient, like the forest had been holding its breath too long and finally let go. The snow didn't melt. It vanished. One morning there were white drifts in the shadowed places, and by the next, only mud, moss, and the scent of wet pine rising from the roots. The river swelled, bloated with runoff, its surface churning brown and thick like it couldn't quite remember how to flow gently anymore. Trees groaned at their roots. The footbridge Etta built in '76 disappeared overnight. By the time she found the driftwood, it had been wedged against her porch rail by the rising water, a stray slab washed up from nowhere, too perfect to be accidental. Laid across its center were 2 maple leaves pressed flat, damp and vivid, and between them, a braid of grass. It was a message, not just in what it was, but in how it got there. The river had brought it, or something had, and it hadn't floated by chance. It had been placed, positioned, aligned. She didn't touch it. Not at first. Just studied it from the doorway. One hand still on the latch, the other holding her mug so tight the ceramic rim dug into her knuckle. The current thundered past, licking at the edge of her garden fence, carrying away pieces of the old world one branch at a time. Etta stood there listening, not to the water, but beyond it. That was when she saw the stones, half submerged in the flooded path, shaped into a crescent. Not random. Each one turned deliberately, glistening from the rain, forming a bend that pointed toward the split boulder near the river's edge. She followed the arc slowly, boots sinking in the sludge, stepping carefully between twisted roots and churned up moss. At the center of the formation, balanced on the stone slab that had once served as a marker for her compost pile, lay half a trout. Not rotten, fresh. The skin still silver, the meat carved cleanly, evenly, as though divided with purpose. Not a kill, a share. And on the far bank, just where the current began to whip hardest around the bend, stood the girl, smaller now against the rushing water. Fragile even. She didn't move. Her long arms hung loose at her sides, one foot just behind the other like she'd been walking along the edge and stopped suddenly. Etta's breath caught. It was more than the sight of her. It was the stillness in her shoulders, the way her head tilted, the faint tremble in the line of her frame. Something was wrong. Then came the sound. A cry, rough and raw. Not loud, but startling. Half cough, half yelp. The girl backed up a step, her feet finding no dry place on the rocks behind her. Etta's eyes jumped to the river. It was rising, fast. A tangle of tree roots had lodged themselves near the far shore, damming the usual crossing point, forcing the current through a tighter channel. Whitecaps danced like claws. The girl turned as if to jump, but then he stepped in front of her. The father, a wall of fur and muscle, tall enough to block the sun where he stood. He didn't make a sound. He simply placed one arm across her body, palm open, halting her with a calmness so absolute it felt like stone. She looked up at him and whimpered once more, the same guttural sound, then dropped to a crouch, arms around her knees, the river slapping at the stones just inches away. He stayed rooted, unshaken. His body between her and the pull of the water. Etta didn't shout, didn't wave. But something surged inside her, a cold urgency that took her legs before her mind caught up. She ran back to the cabin, yanked the shovel from the shed wall, then followed the mud-packed slope toward the bend where runoff had begun pooling behind the tree roots. The river had found a second course, blocked by a thick wad of branches and old pine trunks collapsed in the winter storms. The water had nowhere to go. It was backing up fast, turning the land into a trap. She hit the mud bank at a full stumble and started swinging. Not hard, not with anger, just fast, focused. She dug into the packed earth with the edge of the blade, breaking up the blockage one stroke at a time. The shovel clanged against stone, slid off a buried branch. She grunted through clenched teeth, slipping once, knees soaked to the bone. The river roared in her ears like an oncoming train. She didn't care. She kept digging. A crack opened. Water pushed through in a burst. She stepped aside, shovel raised, and wedged the biggest limb loose. Another gush. Then the mud gave way. The pressure broke in one long sigh. Water surged out in a rush, following the new path like a freed animal. The current shifted, slowed, found its old groove again. She turned and looked across the bank. They were still there, but now the girl stood upright again, eyes wide and fixed on Etta. Her hands clutched the father's arm, but only lightly now. No fear, just something close to awe. He looked too. A deep, steady gaze that held longer than any before. He didn't blink. He didn't nod. But something passed between them across the rushing water. A knowing. An acknowledgement of what had just happened. Not as accident, but as choice. Etta lowered the shovel and stepped back from the edge. She didn't need thanks. She didn't need gesture. The river spoke for them. That night, when the rain finally let up and the wind dropped low, she found something else on the porch. Not on the steps this time, but on the same stone slab where she'd left kindling 2 weeks back. 2 maple leaves, still wet, pressed flat like before. Between them, another braid of grass. Only now the strands were thinner, more intricate, like smaller hands had helped in its weaving. She picked it up and turned it over in her palm. And beneath the leaves, scratched faintly into the slab with something dull but deliberate, were 3 lines. 2 straight. One curved beneath them like a cradle. A symbol. She brought it inside, hands trembling more than usual, and set it beside the compass, now looped in its own cord of grass. The hearth crackled low, painting long shadows against the floor. She opened her journal but didn't write right away. She stared at the page a long time, pen resting against her lip. Then she wrote 1 sentence. "Today I didn't save them, I helped." She paused, added 2 more words. "They let me." And still, even as the fire burned low and her body settled into the worn armchair, she could feel the pulse of the river in her veins, the shape of it, the movement, the unspoken agreement that had passed between her and something older than language. She didn't close her journal. She left it open beside her on the table, and out past the window, past the glass fogged with breath and time. The river flowed steady again, but it carried more than water now. Summer came in hot and humming, the kind of dry that made the bark peel early and the sky press down like a lid. Cicadas sang with a vengeance, thick in the air like the buzz of wires ready to snap. Etta had taken to tying a wet cloth under her chin when she worked outside, but it didn't help much. The heat pushed through everything, even the silence. It was on one of those breathless afternoons, where even the birds had nothing left to say, that she heard the sound of tires crunching old gravel at the edge of her property. A low hum of engines beneath it. More than one vehicle. Not local. Not delivery either. She didn't move from where she sat on the porch shelling beans. Just listened. The rhythm of the gravel told her enough. Men. 5, maybe 6. And dogs. She heard one bark sharp before being cut off by a whistle. Professional. Not friendly. By the time the first boot hit the mossy stone by her gate, Etta had already hidden the compass. She met them halfway down the slope near the old fence. Government tags, clean boots, khaki shirts, hard eyes that looked past her before they looked at her. One had a clipboard, another had a camera hanging from his shoulder. None of them smiled. They introduced themselves as surveyors. Forestry Department, mapping soil erosion and aquatic health, looking for large mammal migratory routes. She asked if that required dogs. The man in charge, lean, red-faced, and too polite by half, explained they'd brought scent trackers because of recent bear sign. They didn't want to be caught off guard. Just protocol. Nothing to worry about. She told them they'd find nothing useful down her way, and that the trails were all waterlogged past the creek bend. They asked to walk through anyway. She didn't say no, but she did something else. When they were out of sight, pushing through fern and wet pine with their gear and pointing sticks, Etta walked back to the cabin and grabbed the old muslin bandages from the apothecary box. She tore them in uneven strips, soaked them in the gray water left from the last batch of boiled dandelion greens, then knotted them at the corners like trail flags. She tied 2 to the branches near the west bluff where the ground gave way into a bog, another near the creek bend where the moss grew ankle-deep and smelled like sulfur. She didn't hide them well. They weren't meant to be hidden. The dogs would follow the damp. Men would follow the dogs. No one would like where they ended up. That night, the stone in front of her porch bore a new shape. 2 sticks crossed, anchored with a river pebble at the center. Simple, clear, don't go out. She didn't. The next morning, her boots still damp from cleaning the porch, she followed the same stretch of path she always took toward the clearing. That's where she found the footprints. Not hers, and not the ones she knew. New ones, wide, heavy, unfamiliar. But it wasn't the size that chilled her. It was the way they moved, fast, direct, too close. The dogs had come this far. That afternoon she built a fire behind the cabin. Not in the pit, in the open. She used damp straw and wet cedar chips, packed them under green pine needles and let the smoke rise thick and gray, curling into the branches like a ghost with nowhere to go. The acrid smell carried. That was the point. She swept ashes across the trail with an old broom and let them settle into the dirt. Dogs hate confusion, and she knew how to confuse. She didn't know, until hours later, that someone had been watching her do it. Because when she woke the next morning, the entire western edge of her property, where the trail curved around the maple grove, was swept clean. Not just a few feet. The whole bend, brushed clear of scent, covered in overturned leaves, pine limbs dragged low along the ground. A pattern in the dirt she recognized now as intentional. A sweep line. He had helped. The father, he had come in the night and cleared the trace. She didn't know how long he'd stayed, but the work was too precise, the effort too much to be random. She sat down on the front step and stayed there until the sun pushed the last of the shadows off the edge of the roof. Then she got up, went inside, and burned the rest of the muslin. By dusk, the surveyors came back, mud-soaked, pants torn, mosquito-bit and short-tempered. One cursed loud enough to rattle the kitchen window. Etta watched from behind the curtain as they loaded up their gear. The dogs didn't bark once. They just whined at the edge of the property, noses pointed in all directions like they couldn't decide which way was forward. The trucks left in silence. Later that night, with the stars sharp and close above the clearing, Etta stood barefoot on the porch and saw the girl again. Not far this time, just at the tree line. Her outline lit soft by the reflection off the moon-drenched grass. She stepped forward, not rushed, not afraid. In her hand was a single braid, new, tighter, patterned differently than the last. She walked up to the step, not all the way, just close, and placed it gently on the porch rail. Then she reached out, not far, just enough, just toward Etta. Then she stepped back and waited. Etta, heart heavy with something she didn't have a name for, took one step forward and raised her hand. The girl reached again and touched her fingers. It wasn't more than a second, not even a full touch, just pressure. But it was enough. Then the girl turned and disappeared into the trees, the grass barely shifting beneath her steps. And on the porch rail, the braid stayed. In the center of it, woven through with a thread of cedar bark, was a single gray hair, one of Etta's. She didn't understand how they'd gotten it, but she understood what it meant. Later, when the coals in the stove burned low and the crickets found their voices again, she sat in the rocker with the braid in her lap. She didn't braid it tighter. She didn't try to read it like a message. She just held it. The cabin creaked softly as it cooled, and the world outside held still, but not empty, never empty again. It started with the air, dry and wrong. The kind that smells like burnt pennies and lingers at the back of your throat. Etta stepped outside with the breakfast kettle still hissing behind her and tasted it before she saw it. The wind had turned overnight. Instead of blowing down from the lake, cool and damp, it pushed hot from the west, riding low and fast across the clearing like it had somewhere urgent to be. By the time the sun cleared the pines, the sky had soured into that yellow-gray haze that never meant anything good. Her knees told her before the clouds did. Something bad was moving in. By noon, the light was all wrong. Too sharp, too quiet. Shadows twisted at odd angles across the porch. Birds were gone. Even the squirrels had vanished into the hollows like they'd been warned. She tried to keep her hands steady, shelling beans at the table. But every few minutes, her eyes went back to the treetops, scanning for nothing in particular, just listening. And then came the sound. Not thunder, not exactly. More like something being ripped open in the distance. A low popping boom, followed by a long roll that never quite faded. She stepped out onto the porch, one hand over her eyes against the brightness, and saw it. Far out past the ridge where the land curved up into the shale hills, a smear of smoke. Thin at first, threaded, then rising with a shape too straight to be natural. Fire, not a campfire, not even a brush burn, real fire, running fire. She didn't curse. She didn't panic. She went inside, grabbed the canvas shoulder bag with the fire tools she hadn't touched in years, and threw in a bundle of dried moss, flint striker, her pocket knife, and 2 canteens. Then she pulled the braided cedar cord from the peg above the hearth and looped it around her neck, just in case. The wind shifted again, smelled worse now, like sap bleeding, like fur burning. She left a note on the table, just a scrap of paper tucked under a flat stone. Back soon, don't come too close. Then she started walking toward the hill. Halfway there, the underbrush started to glow. Not with fire yet, but with heat. The dry leaves underfoot crackled like they were trying to speak. The light went copper, then red. She could hear it now, up ahead, chewing through the deadfall like teeth on dry bone. She didn't need to see the flames to know they were moving fast. She made it to the ridge in time to watch the sky blacken. It wasn't a wall of fire yet, but it was building. The blaze had found a patch of dry pine and fed on it hard, pushing uphill with the wind. Etta didn't run. She knew better. Instead, she broke the rules of most men and did what the old-timers taught her in the logging camps. She walked back down slope, found the edge of the thickest burn line, and started a second fire. A small one, a back burn. She lit the moss slow, let it catch to the dry needles, and watched it curl low across the duff, eating away a patch of earth the big fire couldn't claim. The smoke turned sideways in the wind, and she backed off a few feet, coughed tight in her chest. The heat wrapped around her ankles, not yet painful, but fast. Everything was moving faster now, leaves lifting in strange spirals, cinders dancing without direction, the forest blinking in and out of shadow as the sun lost its grip. Then she heard it, wood cracking, not from flame, from force. A massive tree up ahead, a dead tamarack, shuddered once, then fell, not from the fire, from something else. And then she saw him. The father. He stood just past the burn line, massive hands still outstretched from where he'd pushed the trunk down into the clearing, smothering the fire's forward edge beneath its weight. The fall had carved a gap just wide enough to break the line. Fire hissed up its bark, then stuttered out. Etta froze where she stood, eyes burning, face ash-slicked, watching him lean into the smoke like some old statue of war. Not retreating, not moving, guarding. She took 3 steps forward and almost fell from the slope. A branch caught her shin and she stumbled. When she looked up again, the girl was there too. Crouched just behind her father's side, arms wrapped tight around her own chest, hair swept wild by the heat. Her eyes found Etta's through the smoke. No sound, just that long, fixed stare. Etta nodded once, then turned back toward the fire. The small backburn was working. The heat collapsed inward, pulling air away from the main blaze. The 2 fires met in a crackle and fizz of surrender. The worst of it fell back on itself, and the roar began to quiet. It wasn't over, but it was weakening. Rain would finish it, but not yet. She stayed there until her knees shook and her back ached from standing so stiff. When she turned again, they were gone. She made it home long after dark, her hair stinking of pitch, her hands blistered from gripping tools. She lit a lantern with shaking fingers and hung it low over the porch rail. And there, just past the threshold, waiting in the dark where the glow just barely reached, was the compass. Not lost, not dropped, returned. It sat on the same flat stone where she'd left a bowl of boiled chestnuts a week ago. But now, it had been changed. The brass casing shone clean, polished like a coin, and threaded through the loop at its crown was a new cord. Woven grass, split cedar, and a single copper pine needle twisted like a signature. She picked it up, not breathing. It was warm. She brought it inside and placed it on the mantel beside the braid from the night of the dogs, beside the maple leaves from the river, beside the smooth rock carved with lines she still couldn't name. And only then did she write again in her journal. Not a sentence this time, just a name. Not hers, theirs. And that night, the fire still burning in the hills, the wind still trembling the window panes, Etta didn't sleep. She sat with her back to the wall, facing the door, the compass in her lap, and listened to the woods breathe through the cracks. She wasn't watching for danger. She was waiting for a knock, not on the door, but somewhere deeper, and it never came, because it didn't need to. The first snow of winter came soft and silent, falling overnight like breath held too long. By morning, the whole forest had gone still beneath it. Trees bowed under powder, the river slowed to a crawl under a thin sheet of ice, and the sky hung low and colorless like a lid pressed over the world. Etta stood at the window with her coffee cooling in her hand, the cabin quiet enough to hear her own heartbeat. Outside, the yard lay untouched, not even a squirrel's track breaking the surface. It was the kind of quiet that wrapped around your ribs and stayed there. She pulled on her coat, stiff from where it had dried near the fire, and stepped outside, boots crunching softly across the porch. Her breath rose in small clouds, disappearing before she could follow them with her eyes. Something about the light felt different. Not sharp, not dim, just emptied out, like something had passed through and taken sound with it. And then she saw them. At first, it was only the prints. 2 sets, clear and clean. One large, wide-spaced. One smaller, careful. They trailed from the edge of the trees across her yard, past the old garden posts, and stopped just before the porch. Etta didn't move, just stared, hands clenched inside her sleeves. The tracks didn't wander. They didn't circle. They moved in a straight line. And then, they vanished. Right there, near the stone path, where the snow was no deeper than her ankle. No drift, no scatter. Just gone. As if they'd stepped into mist. She followed them until her breath came short and her hands ached from the cold. But there was nothing else. No broken branches. No sign of struggle or departure. The trail just ended, like a sentence without a period. As if the woods themselves had taken them back. She stood there longer than she meant to, her knees stiffened, her mouth dry, not from worry, but from the shape of the knowing settling inside her chest. They'd left, not because of danger, not because of fear, because it was time. She returned to the porch slowly, one foot dragging from the ache in her hip. And that's when she saw it. Something new, placed right beside the door, under the eaves where no snow had touched. A heart, woven from dry reed and curled fern stalk, threaded with 2 strands of hair, one the pale silver of her own, and the other the thick auburn she recognized from the fur left behind in the cellar last winter. The heart was perfect, not childlike, not rough. It had weight and balance, a shape made to last. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Not from cold, from memory. Inside, she opened the journal she hadn't written in since the fire weeks back. She slipped the heart between the pages, then reached for the compass that still hung above the hearth. The cord had frayed. She tied it anew using one of the grass braids, then pressed both items flat across the heart before closing the journal over them. On the cover, in faded marker, the word "field" still lingered from the old brand she'd scratched on it years ago. She crossed it out, wrote just one word, "family." That night she didn't light a fire. The cabin stayed dark, lit only by the moon through the windows and the soft flicker of snow catching starlight outside. She lay beneath the quilt with her hand resting over the journal. Not asleep, not awake. Listening. But there were no more knocks, no footsteps, no deep breaths from just beyond the porch. And that was all right, because the silence no longer felt empty. 12 years later, the cabin was still standing. The porch slanted deeper now. The fence around the garden had long fallen. Moss climbed the north wall in thick patterns that looked almost like writing. Inside, the stove had gone cold, the windows gone cloudy with time, but on the shelf above the hearth, still undisturbed, sat the journal, the compass, and the dried heart of grass, sealed in dust and memory. A young man stood at the doorway with a pack slung over his shoulder and his hat pressed to his chest. He didn't call out, didn't ask who lived there. He knew. His name was Gideon. He ran his fingers along the doorframe, then stepped inside. The air was musty. Old pine and smoke, dried herbs and leather. The smell of a life lived without hurry. He moved through the space quietly, his boots thudding soft on the worn boards. He paused at the table. The kettle was still there, a thin ring of dust around its base. He found the journal without needing to search. Picked it up and flipped through it slowly, the pages stiff but still strong. His eyes moved over the lines, some faint, some dark, some almost too shaky to read. At the last page, he stopped, ran his fingers over the folded braid, smiled. He didn't speak, he didn't cry. He just nodded, slow and quiet, like someone accepting something sacred. Outside, the snow fell again, the same way it had that first morning, light and unhurried. Beyond the clearing, the woods stood watch, still, whole, and though no tracks marked the yard now, and no breath steamed against the windows, something about the place still held, still waited, still promised. And through the glass behind him, Gideon watched the treetops sway, and the forest, impossibly, seemed to breathe. Sometimes what changes us isn't a great storm or a loud revelation. It's the quiet things, a shared glance, a gift left without a name, a door never locked, not out of carelessness but out of hope. And maybe that's what this was all about, not proof, not discovery, but presence. The kind of presence that doesn't demand to be known, only to be respected. The kind that watches from the tree line, not to threaten, but to understand. There are places in this world where the lines between what's wild and what's human blur. Not in the noise of headlines or the flash of a camera, but in the stillness of a forest at dusk, in the hush of snowfall, in the soft return of a gesture once offered. We spend so much of our lives trying to be heard, trying to be seen. But sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is simply listen, not with our ears, but with our hearts, to the rhythms of the land, to the wordless language of trust, to the simple truth that kindness doesn't need translation, because some bonds are built in silence, some families are chosen without ceremony, and sometimes the greatest love is the one that leaves no mark, only memory. Out there, beyond the fences we build and the names we give things, there is still mystery. There is still grace. And there is still something waiting, not to be captured or proven, but to be met with open hands and a steady heart. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or made you think of a moment you didn't know mattered until now, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your memories, or just a symbol that says, I understand. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next story. There's more to tell, more waiting out there in the quiet, and I'd be honored if you'd walk a little farther with me. Until then, take care of each other and listen closely. The forest is still speaking,